Afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. Welcome to episode 20. Oh no, episode 22, I think, of Crazy Talk. I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is your first time watching Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV talk show where we talk about all sorts of things related to mental health. And like I mentioned, I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, I am so glad we haven't scared you off. Thank you so much for coming back. Before we get the show started today, I want to give a big shout out to the Canadian Business School Conference. They are in Fredericton this year, and I was speaking up at Planet Hatch earlier today, and so it was really great being able to talk about student leader mental health with them, and I just, really appreciate that they're making mental health a priority for their organization. So I'm really excited today. I have an extra special guest today, someone who I've recently met on Facebook, which is my favorite kind of guest. So we've got Jason Miller on the show. Jason, welcome to Crazy Talk. It's really great to have you. Do you want to start off by telling us a little bit about the work that you do and why you do the work that you do?
Sure, I'd love to. I appreciate it. I do a lot of grassroots type of mental health advocacy, and I teach I co-facilitate a class called Hope and Forgiveness. It's through the recovery support groups at my church. Mm-hmm. I'm also active in Alcoholics Anonymous as a sponsor, and have done a lot of service work over the years through AA. I spent 3 years taking an AA meeting down to a 5-day detox facility every week for 3 years, and my turn ended, so I rotated out of that. That was fairly recently. I have a blog that I maintain, and also a Facebook page, and I am going to I've committed to, God willing, go out on a busy street corner here in Kansas City, Missouri on August 18th and hold up a sign saying I have bipolar disorder and I'm not ashamed. It's part of Project hashtag Project I Am Not Ashamed. There's a gentleman up in Waterloo, Iowa named Ross Trowbridge who has borderline personality disorder, and he did this on his own months and months ago, and got a lot of positive feedback in the community and the media. And basically the idea is to get people who have a mental illness in various cities around the country to go out and do this, and to be available, make yourself available to show people that we're not weird, we're not scary people, and 1 out of 4 Americans suffers from a mental illness, and that may be an international statistic as well. I'm not sure. And also to be available to answer people's questions. Mm-hmm. And I think the last count that I saw was that he's got people in 63 cities who are doing this. So it's a pretty neat project. And then basically the rest of what I do is things like this, and I write for my blog, and I share my story as often as possible. I think sharing our stories is one of the most powerful things we can do to help other people. And it's very cathartic for the person who's sharing. So, that's pretty much. And the reason I do it is paying it forward, because I have bipolar disorder and alcoholism, and I struggled with it for many, many years, and went through some pretty serious trials and tribulations, many of them self-inflicted. But I've gotten to a place where I'm good. I'm in good, solid, stable recovery. I've had a lot of help along the way, and I want to give back.
Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of people who kind of work in sharing their story and that sort of thing, like, I mean, I guess I can only really speak from my own experience, but like doing that work and sharing my story, for me, it's kind of my way of giving back to, people who shared their stories before me. You know what I mean? Like, kind of, I was lucky enough to have people kind of share their stories with me. And then I want to kind of pass that gift along and share my story with other people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who went before us. Even like with the example of AA. I mean that excuse me, that was really the missing piece of my recovery. I started recovering in '94. I got with a good therapist and got the tool, some good tools, including cognitive behavioral therapy that helped me cope with my distorted bipolar disorder thinking. But it wasn't until 2010 when I got into AA and spiritual recovery, and when I really started to get into a really healthy place. In it's still one day at a time, but I just think back, and I'm standing on the shoulders of there were 100 men, Depression era drunks, who started this thing in 1935, and we're all of us in 12-step recovery are standing on their shoulders. So just relating back to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to ask a little bit more about kind of the spiritual aspect of recovery. But first, I want to give a shout out to Julie Savoy, who commented and said, "Thank you to you both, Jason and Lee, for doing what you do and for being advocates for mental health." Julie, thank you so much for tuning in. Really great to hear that you're on the show today. So that's awesome. So you mentioned that, like, the spiritual aspect, Jason, of your recovery was like a very important aspect of your recovery. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and kind of, because I think maybe that spirituality piece is something that maybe a lot of, like, I don't want to say stereotypical, but maybe a lot of like kind of, I guess, traditional methods of mental health recovery don't necessarily look at that spiritual piece, right?
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what value that's brought you?
Sure, I would, and I would preface it by saying that that a lot of people have negative connotations when it comes to, they hear the word spiritual, they think of church, religion, that type of thing, and I know I did. I say that with confidence about at least some other people, because I certainly did before I got into AA. I mean, that was pure desperation that drove me there. That was my last. That was a port in a storm, any port in a storm, if you will. And I mean, I didn't want to have anything to do with God or in AA is pretty watered down when it comes to spirituality. It's in any 12-step program. We call it the higher power of your understanding. You can choose the group that you're in, or Buddha, or the Hindu gods, or Jesus, or a doorknob. If you want to be absurd, anything you want. And so that kind of takes some of kind of eases some of that, I think, that maybe the trauma that people have experienced with religion in the past. But as far as how it's benefited me, it's given me, and again, well, part of the preface, again, I'll say that it may not be for everybody. There's no one size fits all to recovery. It's just what's worked for me. So, but the benefit that it's given me is that it's taken me through that process of the 12 steps of spiritual healing, where I've surrendered my illness to the higher power of my understanding, with the faith that I'll find healing and compassion and love, and that one day at a time that I'll be able to remain sober and stable and sane with its help. And, in working with a sponsor, which is a person that you find in the program that is kind of a mentor, somebody who's been in there longer, working through the steps with you. I did a what they call a fearless and searching moral inventory, which is basically writing down all the bad things or the the harms, I'll say, that I've caused without putting a negative connotation on it, to people, places, and institutions, and then talking to my sponsor about it. It's basically like a confession, and then going. The next step is determining what my character defects are, my flaws as a human being, which there's also a distinction. You have to be kind of careful. There's a fine line between looking at that and recognizing that, hey, this isn't necessarily a character defect. This is part of my illness. But then becoming humble and willing to have God remove those, and then going out and making amends for the harms that I've caused, and being able to forgive others, hopefully get their forgiveness, and at least being able to forgive myself after making those amends. And then continue on. And the biggest piece, the most helpful piece that I think could benefit anybody in recovery or who's trying to recover from a mental illness or from an addiction, is, regardless of whether you're looking at it from a spiritual angle or not, is what the principle of the 12th step is service, which is helping others. Like we talked about earlier, sharing your story. That's a big piece. Getting out of self, and when we're in our illness, we're very naturally, because we're the way we feel, we're hurting so badly, we become so self-absorbed and selfish and self-centered. When you get out of self and do things to help other people, which is not easy, I admit, when you're in your illness, it's a great relief. So that's how it's helped me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where, like, I mean, this is, I guess, kind of harkening back to what we were saying before, but I know I get so much of my, sense of self, and so much of my recovery is really based around that kind of service aspect. And, doing what I can to help other people. I don't necessarily have like a very, I guess, religious background, but like, to me, like, that's really like kind of the purpose of being on this earth, you know what I mean, is like helping other people. And I just can't conceptualize a different way. You know what I mean? Like, it's so much a part of my purpose here. So I think that's really interesting. And that whole idea of, getting out of yourself and kind of finding those human connections. Cause I think that human connection piece is so important. And I read like a really interesting thing the other day where it was like, we can't necessarily control who loves us, but we can control how much we love other people. You know what I mean? And we can always be giving and be putting ourselves out there, which I just think is fabulous.
Absolutely. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, there's a quote, and I'm going to butcher it. I'll just paraphrase it, but people are selfish and self-centered and can be mean and maybe hateful, but love them anyway. Something along those lines. And that's not always easy to do, obviously. Mm-hmm. But what you said is really, that's a strong foundation for my recovery. And like I said, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with spirituality per se. And for me, I think maybe you touched on something there that just really resonated with me about my own recovery, is that I really had to have that spiritual component, the spiritual piece, to get well, because, you're an amazing, to me, someone like you is amazing, because it seems like you're just the way you are naturally, the way you described, wanting to help other people and being of service. I was the opposite. I lived to serve self before that. And I had to have, from my own perspective, not injecting this religion or spirituality in anybody else, but I had to have God beat me into the ground to change my whole perspective and way of living. And AA was the vehicle for doing that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to come back to that, but we're going to get a couple more comments. So Kathy Campbell said, thanks to you both. You're sharing important insights and information. Happy Saturday. So thank you, Kathy, for tuning in. And Julie, I see your comments too, and we're going to get to those by the end of the show. So thank you so much for being here and for being engaged. So Jason, I do want to ask, like, you've mentioned forgiveness a couple of times, and that idea of, kind of living to serve self and, learning lessons in terms of living to serve other people and that sort of thing. And you've mentioned, forgiving other people, and you've also mentioned forgiving yourself. And I think forgiving yourself is like a harder thing for a lot of people to do. Like, we can sometimes really empathize with people who have wronged us, but we have a hard time empathizing with ourselves when we've done something. So how does that kind of forgiveness piece work for you? And do you have any, I guess, maybe tips for people who are looking to learn some self-forgiveness?
Yeah, well, self-forgiveness is still tough for me. I mean, forgiveness in general, to be honest. And I guess if you don't mind, I can start with forgiving other people, because that's been really the emphasis of my recovery, more so than forgiving myself. And maybe I definitely need to work more on self-forgiveness. But in the program in AA, we focus more on forgiving other people, getting rid of those resentments. We call it, as it says in the big book, resentment is the number one offender that'll lead us back to a drink, harboring hatred and ill feelings towards other people. And one of the suggestions is to pray for the other person, and that's the most powerful tool I've found. And it doesn't have to be necessarily prayer. It could be meditation or thinking good thoughts, wishing goodwill for the other person. In other words, the other person being the one that you're resentful towards, or who has harmed you, or you perceive that they've harmed you in some way. And I've had several resentments that were really deeply rooted, so much so that I had to literally pray for that other individual for, in one case, 2 years before it actually went from my head down to my heart. And so I don't know. Frankly, I don't really have good answers for you on self-forgiveness. I could speak to it from a Christian perspective, maybe, and that's kind of where my spirituality has evolved over the last couple of years. I mentioned that I participate in a program or a class that I help teach at my church on hope and forgiveness. And again, we focus a lot on forgiving others. But the piece of self-forgiveness, I know one thing we talk about in there is that if you're, God forgives everyone, is what we believe as Christians, that forgiveness is available to everyone if we just ask for it. And if God forgives us, if God is forgiving me, if Jesus is forgiving me, then who am I to not forgive myself? I mean, I'm just a mere mortal. And maybe a person who's not a Christian could think about that from a broader perspective of, if other people are forgiving me, then, I've got a pretty big ego if I'm not willing to forgive myself. So, maybe a lot of that not being willing to forgive yourself is about pride and ego in a kind of a perverse sense.
Yeah. Oh, that totally makes sense to me. It's funny because, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, I presented at a business school conference today, and I was talking about, student leader mental health and that sort of thing. And I talked about what I call the me exception, which is the idea that a lot of the time, whether people are like, student leaders or anyone, sometimes we'll say, if my friend was struggling, I would want them to get help. But me, I'm the exception, right? Like, I'm the one who needs to struggle alone. Like, I don't judge other people for getting help, but I'll judge myself for getting help and that sort of thing. And I do think that, and it's one of the things that I said in my presentation was, I was like, I don't really know how to tell you this other than to tell you that you are not the exception, right? Like, we have this shared humanity. And so, if you want to extend those kindnesses to other people want to extend them to you. And also, like, you need those as well. Like, there is kind of that, there isn't a me exception, I guess. There are just certain things that are, if not universal, then pretty universal. You know what I mean? Like, if not universal, then definitely close.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes.
I agree.
I'm just kind of trying to be mindful of time, but there are so many things that I want to ask you about this, because this is just, a very kind of different perspective than the perspective that I work in, which I love, because, if people just wanted to hear my perspective, then I would just like be up here on my own. So I'm so glad you're here. Appreciate one of the questions that has been kind of bubbling around in my mind, and I've been thinking about this kind of personally for a while, is this idea of, if you could go back in time and never have experienced, the stuff you experienced, never have, experienced the bipolar disorder or experienced the substance use, is that something you would want to do? Because people tend to be pretty divided on this.
Absolutely not. I don't even have to give that a second of consideration. One of the things in AA, we have what's called the promises on page 83, which are gifts that we receive from having worked the steps, from having that spiritual transformation. It says we will not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. And to put it into a broader context beyond, people are probably getting tired of hearing about AA. In a broader context, my past all those experiences brought me to this very moment today, which is all I really have, to be here sharing my experience, strength, and hope with you and whomever may be listening. And I hope it's helping someone. I really do. Because I feel like that's my purpose now, is to help other people, particularly help other people who are suffering and struggling, particularly those with not exclusively, but particularly those with mental illness and addictions. And I think my experience, strength, and hope, and my story they qualify me to do that. I'm certainly not. I'm not a clinician by any means, but I'm a layperson who's been there and done that, and I have a pretty strong program, if you will, of recovery regimen or whatever you want to call it, and I think I have a lot to offer in terms of sharing that with other people, and that's what I try to do on a daily basis. I try to live my life that way because I feel like that's why I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned I'm not a clinician kind of in passing, but I think that can be that's a strength, in my opinion. I do a lot of work kind of up here in Canada in peer support and that sort of thing. Or I guess it's a topic that I'm really interested in. And it's one of those things where, not being a clinician, not saying anything bad about clinicians, but sometimes not being a clinician makes you more accessible to people, right? When you are just, a person sharing your story, that's almost more relatable to people sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And you're not getting paid to do it either. Nothing. I mean, I have a great therapist. I love her. She's given me so much. She's worth every penny. But she's doing it she's got to make a living. I'm doing this and you're doing this as an avocation. So this is an act of love on our part. And I think that makes a difference to people too, in terms of where we're coming from. And it's peer to peer. We're at their level. It's not a hierarchy where, hey, I'm up here and you're down here. So I think, there's something to be said for that.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredible. We're 5 minutes to 1, which is just wild to me because I just feel like we could chat about all this stuff all day. So, thank you so much for being on the show. For the people who are tuning in, who are wow, Jason is incredible. I want to, read his blog. I want to get in touch. What's the best way for people to kind of find out more about the work that you're doing?
Well, I have two vehicles, if you will. I've got a Facebook page that's called Inspiration and Emotional Courage. If you search for that, you'll find it. But there's a colon after that, and it's mental illness. And then there's some more after that: mental illness, addiction, and something else. I don't recall what it is, frankly. And then my blog is it's In Recovery. In Recovery is the last part of it. And then my blog is the URL is www.bipolarisbeautiful.com. But don't let the URL fool you. It covers all types of mental illness and addiction and various topics related to that. And I'm always looking for people who are interested in sharing their stories, writing them and submitting them to my blog for publication. And if you want to do it anonymously, if you don't want to put your name on it, that's great too.
Okay. So people are going to absolutely be thrilled to like get in touch with you. So I'm really excited about that. I'm pretty sure Julie put the link in the comments below to the group. We'll double check that it's the right link. If it's not, we'll put the other link in, but I think it's probably the right one. So we'll put some links into the comments once this show wraps up. But again, Jason, thank you so much for being on the show. It was really, really great having you. And I love, the perspective and the honesty that you brought to the show, and I really appreciate it. So if you are watching this show and you think someone who would really benefit from hearing this, be sure to send this video their way. Share it. Send them to Jason's blog and Jason's page. And if you are watching this show and you're like, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun, and I want to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox, you can do that by signing up for my mailing list. And I will put a link to that mailing list in the comments below about 5 minutes after the show wraps up. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you again, Jason, for being on the show. And we will see you next Saturday, again at 12:30 Atlantic, where I will be interviewing Gabe Howard from Psych Central. So thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.